Good afternoon. It's always tough going after the big boss, especially when she sets the expectation that I'm going to talk about whiskey bars, which I will talk about a little bit. It's great to be here. Thank you, Dasher, for hosting us and having us here at this event. As you've heard, it's an amazing partnership between Hewlett-Packard and Dasher, one that's been around for a long time. So it's great for me personally to be here. I'm based out on the East Coast, so anytime I can get a chance to come out to Napa, I'm happy to take up on that. I'm going to talk about big data, and I'm going to give you a point of view on it, certainly our point of view on it. I'm going to tell you some stories and really try to make sense of what we see going on out there when it comes to big data and how many of our customers have taken advantage of it, many of them with Dasher and HP together. The first thing that I want to say, though, about big data is I was one of the founders of Vertica. We started the company in late 2005, 2006, before the term big data was ever around. And then probably around 2008, 2009, that term started to come up everywhere. And we made a conscious decision not to mention big data in any of our marketing materials because we thought that it wasn't descriptive enough about the job that we would do. We were acquired by Hewlett-Packard in 2011, and shortly after that, I remember doing a presentation in our executive briefing center in Palo Alto to a South Korean company. And I didn't have big data anywhere in my slides. There was a translator. I gave the presentation, and at the end, there was a Q&A session. And I don't speak Korean, but every 8 seconds, I recognized the word big data. Everything was Korean that I didn't understand, big data. And I left that meeting and I said to the team, I think we should start talking about big data. Not that anyone really knows what it means, but it's recognized clearly globally as something that we should all care about. But people struggle with it. You know, what does it mean? My mom asks me this question all the time. You know, what do you do? What is big data? So I'm going to give you my point of view on that and share some stories as we go through this. I remember explaining to Meg that we went from kilobyte to megabyte to gigabyte to terabyte to exabyte to petabyte to exabyte to zettabyte to brontobyte, and Meg looked at me like I was from out of this world. But I remind people that if you think back to 1983 when Michael Jackson was on the top charts, my first hard drive was actually a whopping 20 megabytes. And I thought, wow, I'm going to store every single piece of information, every game, every Bank Street Writer document at the time on that 20 megabyte hard drive. And it's going to have everything for the rest of my life. And I didn't know what a gigabyte was. Turns out, if I did know what a gigabyte was back in 1983, it would have cost me $1 million. So I think we sit here today and we think about petabytes and maybe exabytes and zettabytes as such a foreign object. But it's happening. The innovation that's going on continues around CPU, memory, Moore's Law, around disk. And the amount of information that products create, you know, as an example, an MRI image today of a mouse brain is a relatively small file. It's about a megabyte. They have these sort of mass spectrometry MRI devices now coming out that for each mouse brain will store about a petabyte of data. And when they get into another sort of down the road innovation that they're working on of combining electrons there, you're at about a zettabyte per mouse brain. Massive amounts of atomic detail in information. And what it's doing from an industry perspective is it's really changing the way that we think about not just the storage of information, the processing information, analytics of information, but also about BI and what it actually means as a business. We used to close books and we'd have sort of a month before we had to put it all together. You know, same store sales as an example in retail, you could wait a while before you get that data. Now you have to have it immediately. But something else that goes on around the price elasticity of data is that if back in 1983 there was such a thing as an Apache web server running a lot of these storefront and web properties, one Apache log, or for $1, you could actually store roughly 3.5 Apache logs. So nobody really logged anything back then. It was too expensive from a processing power and a storage standpoint. If you fast forward that today, for that same dollar, you can now store over 35 billion logs of data. So what we're doing right now is we've shifted into this era where these breadcrumbs and fingerprints are everywhere. And instead of looking back and saying, let's extrapolate a small piece of information with a BI report and figure out what we think happened, you can actually look back now and determine exactly what happened. You can see all the logs, and hence logging and analytics of log data combined with your traditional CRM and ERP data, combined with some of the social data, semi-structured data, it becomes really important to have that view across all your information. But it is so much more complicated now than it ever was, and the velocity and the volume of data are just like nothing that anyone has ever experienced. A lot of the folks leading the way here have definitely been the web monsters. The companies, many of whom are based out here in Silicon Valley, who have really pushed the limits. And some of the key learnings, in addition to the log everything that I just described, are that they now analyze everything. And they don't only analyze what did happen, they look at what didn't happen. Somebody went and filled up a shopping cart, but they didn't buy. Why? Where did they go? What did they visit? What did they look at? So it's not just capturing the event that happened, which was sort of the traditional transaction that we thought of. It's all about capturing events that didn't happen. The other thing is that you used to have a small sample size, and you might have wanted to run a test. Now, with some of the customers that I'm going to talk about towards the end, they're A/B testing everything. And the sample size is almost infinite. What it also means is that from a segmentation and a profiling perspective, you can actually segment down to an individual. I think it has profound impact, or it already has and will continue, on things like healthcare. If I have a terminal illness, being treated as me, as an individual, my DNA, my environmental behavior, down to the personalization of me. This is happening with marketing today. This is happening across the board in so many areas. You still want to relate it to a cohort, or somebody who bought this might like this or might buy that, but you have the power to drill into all the detailed information as well as roll it all up. And that, Meg talked about the new style of IT and businesses being driven by IT and what technology is enabling, and this is a huge part of that. Speaking of the whiskey bar, so this is one of my favorite images. You may have seen this before. This came from Facebook, and what they did was they just took a blank canvas, a blank screen, and every place that there's a friend in the world, they created a dot. And every friendship, they created an arc connecting those. And what they actually did was they, of course, drew a map of the world without drawing a map of the world. What's really interesting about this and data generally is that for them, what's most important is not necessarily all the detailed data in this case, but stepping back and seeing the dark areas. You can clearly see that China is a massive opportunity. Central Africa, Central Northern Africa, massive opportunity. But being able to take data and put it in a platform and analyze it in so many different ways and then visualize is a really powerful thing. And as Meg mentioned, we have a great win at Facebook. They've built their data warehouse on Vertica, a company that loves to innovate on its own. But they are dramatically changing their business outcomes by using information. And as Meg also said, let's face it, they are a big data company. So many companies today, whether they're in retail or selling books or doing this or that, at the end of the day, the data is such a core asset of the business, and how they leverage that data, how they interact with their customers and their partners and their employees is critically important. So it's, in your shoes, it's super easy. You just, purchase some of this. Of course, I work for a technology company, a vendor, if you will. We consume a lot of technology at HP as well. As you can imagine, HPIT and what we do with the businesses is critically important. So I get this. I get when you go out and everybody talks about big data, this is what it looks like. And how do you make a decision? How do you figure out which projects to do? How do you figure out which vendors to test? How do you do proof of concepts when there's so many different elements to this? And I think one huge risk of big data is that if people just try to boil the ocean and think it's a panacea that will solve every problem, and let's face it, there are so many projects that get earmarked as big data, projects that people always wanted to do but never quite had the budget, and now there is a budget called big data, there's a risk that nothing gets achieved. So we really wanted to simplify the way organizations sort of take their information, take their data, manage it, leverage it, and monetize it. And Meg mentioned this morning our big data platform known as Haven. Haven itself is not a product. Haven is a platform. Hadoop is the H, autonomy is the A, Vertica is the V, enterprise security, which wraps all around it, is the E, and then this notion of NApps, next generation applications being built with data at the very core of what they do. So this is a journey for us. We announced this just over a year ago. Vertica is one piece of this, but this is exactly where our strength plays. Because what we find is when you take on these projects, it's not just about the software and taking all the different information sources, getting them into the right place, securing them, doing the right things with them based on the right engines, and then serving them out to the right people. It goes well beyond that. As a software person, I didn't know a lot about hardware. And all of a sudden, I'm sort of dreaming about BL460C blades and DL380, Gen 8 servers. But it's because you have to know about that stuff. None of the projects we do can be done without best-in-class converged infrastructure, can be done without partners and services wrapped around it, can be done, in many cases, I know you're going to hear from HP Financial Services, with the right financing package wrapped around it. These are big opportunities and big challenges that customers are facing, and we have to come at it using all the innovation and all the assets that HP brings. And so for me personally, it's been exciting and eye-opening at the same time how much it really takes to leverage that information and take advantage of it. But again, the danger is trying to boil the ocean and just coming in and saying, we're going to transform and do this whole big data thing. That's not what we do. We like to find that use case. We like to find those challenges that companies face that they've really been trying to solve maybe for years or decades. And now there's enough horsepower, there's enough analytic capabilities, there's the right software and the right people to come in and make that change happen. I'll tell you a little bit about Vertica if you don't know what it is. What we did when we started the company was we looked at the traditional landscape of databases and data as it related to analytics. And most databases were invented in a very different time for different data, different volumes, and weren't really meant for analytics. They were meant for OLTP or other transactional workloads. What we wanted to do is take all the good things about databases and keep them. SQL, fully relational, all those characteristics, but also fix a whole bunch of things that nobody had fixed before. And so we wrote this from the ground up. We designed it from scratch. Our co-founder is a guy named Mike Stonebreaker who done Ingress and Postgres, Illustra and Formix. I remember in the early days we actually couldn't delete data, which was wonderful for us since we charged per terabyte. But we developed and it evolved. And it's become a very robust, not only database, but analytic platform. But again, it is one piece of the pie. And what we always knew when we started the company was that one size does not fit all. And part of the problem with the traditional industry that's so different from this new style of IT is everybody was trying to force fit one solution to do everything, whether it was analytics or big data or anything. And we believe that you have to find the right tool for the right job, but at HP, we've got to make sure all those tools and solutions integrate and work together. So I'm going to tell you a couple stories about some really innovative customers and companies, many of whom are joint customers that we have with Dasher, like One Kings Lane. who are doing really cool things with information. So in this particular case, if you're not familiar with it, an amazing e-tailer providing some of the most sort of high-end decor experiences to customers. And what they're doing with information is they recognize the fact that you can't just pummel people with emails these days and expect that they're going to open it. So as an e-tailer, especially in this segment, finding the right consumers and being able to maintain that conversation with them, which they do very effectively through blogs and through other channels, as well as some emails, and they A/B test everything for efficacy, it drives the conversion, it drives the retention, and drives a better experience for their customers who are coming in and receiving things that they really care about. So this is an example of an e-tailer. Obviously, lots of clickstream data, lots of clickstream log analytics, looking at who's staying on a web page, how long are they staying, what are they purchasing, etc. But in my mind, this again is an example of a company that really is a data company, but you may not think about it as a data company. I'm sure a lot of you have played Farmville or Words with Friends or some of the other games that Zynga does. I think what's so fascinating about a company like Zynga is when you think about it, they created a new industry. I mean, before Zynga, the online gaming segment was just not that big. You know, most of computer gaming was done at a personal computer or at a console in front of a TV. Zynga leveraged the social networking, certainly Facebook specifically, and they created an entirely new industry. But when you think about gaming, you know, when I was a kid and I played games, I always wanted to finish the game. And once you finish the game, you're done with the game and you go buy another game. Well, what if you couldn't finish the game? What if the game was personalized to you and it almost never ended? That's basically one of the experiences that Zynga has created with data. Understanding everything about the profile of their customer so that if you're in Farmville and you're driving a tractor, you see a billboard that's germane to you, and I see a billboard that's actually completely different and germane to me. Again, a lot of A/B testing, a lot of profiling, a lot of what banks often did with scoring credit data, they applied a very similar model to gaming. But what I like most about Zynga as an example is I think you can say technology was absolutely the enabler, which it was. But they also did some things organizationally that are very unique that I think made them successful with analytics and data. One of the things they did was they studied the insurance industry. And they said, well, that's an industry that for years, really going all the way back to Lloyd's of London, has leveraged information. But when they actually got up and close to it, they realized that the actuaries, the people that needed the data the most, they're often put off in a corner. They're given a sliver of data from an enterprise data warehouse that's usually outdated, and they're asked to go create the models that the whole business is run on in that silo. And so what Zynga said is, that's probably not going to work. What they did was they embedded a data scientist, a real statistician. Data scientist, I think, is maybe the second most overused two words. But a real statistician in each business group where they had a general manager, gaming developers, and this person would literally be spitting out information on A/B testing of what was going on. So they would pick up chatter in games when people liked something, and then they would develop more screens like that so that they would continue to drive better adoption of the games. But they really took advantage of using data and analytics with a business unit or business units that were set up to do it. And again, Zynga, you know, they are a data company, probably posing as a gaming company. This is one of my favorite projects. HP is doing a lot of work with Conservation International. And you know, at first glance, you might think to yourself, what does that have to do with big data? And what I haven't talked a lot about yet, but Meg mentioned this morning, is that I think traditionally, if you think about your information, it was very much structured data. We've been moving into this world of what I call dark data, which is very much semi-structured log data, as well as unstructured data. And so we engaged with Conservation International on a project to set up camera traps and sensors in the most remote rainforest regions of the world in an effort to determine which species are most at risk of becoming extinct. And so we created something called a wildlife picture index that you can go online and see. And what it does is it overlays a map of the world, of these different regions, and you can actually see interactively in very much a business intelligence way, where you double click, you see images of different actual pictures from the camera traps of all sorts of really cool animals, many of which I had never seen before. But the whole point of this is basically to keep score, because as much as everybody talks about, you know, what's going on, degradation of some of the natural resources that we all cherish here, it was basically just left abandoned. And thanks to technology, these camera traps, they actually fly drones a lot now. They collect a massive amount of data, and they can see what impact deforestation, for instance, is having from a climate perspective, from a species perspective, using statistical regression on image data and other both structured and unstructured data to do something really, really cool. We have other examples, some of the largest agricultural companies that are actually doing some similar things. We have one customer that actually is taking images, having farmers send images of crops back, and they do analysis on those images and can determine when there's mold, when there's other types of things that are going to get in the way, and then they can acutely treat those plants down to the individual plant thanks to GPS and some other things. It's a pretty similar use case to Conservation International. Cerner is a large healthcare software organization. They provide solutions to a lot of hospitals, to a lot of physician offices. And we originally started working with them on a really innovative project that actually didn't have too much to do with healthcare in the beginning. What they did was they created these things called breadcrumbs. And in their software, they created a virtual sensor, if you will, that tracked everything that was happening in the execution of their software code, but correlated it with the actual experience that a physician or a nurse or an office practitioner was doing with their software. So for instance, if a physician was logging on late at night and spending a lot of time going through images or other parts of the medical records, this would all get logged. They fed that back into their product management team, and now their product management team, rather than just having some focus groups and other sessions with customers, they have real data on what's going on. This type of phone home, you know, HP does it with many of our server lines. We have a proactive support we can provide based on some of the data, the telemetry data that's coming off of them. It's super powerful. What they then did is they took, on the clinician side, they started taking a lot of the information and running massive amount of analytics. They actually identified just over 500 cases of undiagnosed sepsis, which is terminal pretty quickly, in a whole group of patients that were basically discharged from a hospital and had no idea they actually had sepsis. So they go back, they create these new tests, these new models, they identify it through the historical data. So lots of very powerful medical examples that we see there. So what I want to do is open it up to questions. I have a plug for our upcoming Big Data Conference in Boston for anyone interested. It's a great event. You'll barely hear us as a vendor talking at the event. It's really about our customers and everything that they can do. At the end of the day, I love the stories of the customers. I love the stories of our partners. That's the stuff in this industry right now when it comes to big data that people are so interested in hearing about, because I think so much of this is a missionary work. There's just so much unknown. It's evolving so quickly. So this is a great venue to do it, and you'll hear a lot more stories. So I guess with that, I'd love to open it up, and I won't be as good as Meg Whitman, but happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
So, the big data, especially in the life sciences, is that we retain data for extended periods of time, and you can retain very large quantities, like multiple petabytes of it.
Yep.
But historically, this isn't a really good market segment for companies like HP. Because essentially, what we need is high volumes of hyper-dense storage, but at really cheap and decompressed levels.
Yep.
And no one's really stepped up to create a market segment for this, where essentially you're storing all this vast amount of data, but there's
Yeah, great question. So I'll repeat the question for those folks who couldn't hear it. So there's this, I'll call it a tension almost between storing massive amounts of data for compliance, where you basically just want to park the data. It doesn't have to be available maybe in real time or near real time. And having solutions that can do that. And I think the question was HP doesn't really focus on that as much versus having data storage solutions, maybe like a Vertica, with some of the server infrastructure that we run on that are available in much more real time. So HP is working on a lot. I'll broadly classify this as information lifecycle management. But I think what you're starting to see is we're thinking about the storage of the bits in the context of potential workloads that might be run on those bits, and factoring in the cost of the storage as well. So many of our customers who've been forced to store data, telcos have to retain 7 years of call detail records, financial services firms have to retain. A lot of them actually want to go back and start looking in that data and seeing if they can do some data science work and figure out things. So I think more people probably are going to want it to be a little bit more readily available. But there's no question there's a need for solutions that may also just park the data. And what we want to do is be able to easily move that information around based on the workload that'll happen. So if you've got a massive amount, if you've got petabytes of data and you're not really accessing it much, then let's park it on that stuff that, you know, it's less expensive and we don't have to pull it out. But all of a sudden, if the SEC comes in and says, we want these answers, we have to be able to move that data out to maybe an in-memory solution or something that is SSDs or slightly faster than, you know, very large kind of form factor spinning disks or whatever it is. So I think it's something that the whole industry is struggling with, because when you start looking at this massive amount of information, you start doing the cost and you say, well, I can't afford to store this all on, you know, the best in class. But I think it's our job to figure out how we make it easy for you. Again, not just looking at the bits, because a lot of people don't know what's in those bits, but intelligently saying, you know, for this information based on the usage patterns, we're going to keep it over here. Other questions? There's a couple, yeah. Okay, yeah, he's got a mic too. Thanks.
Our biggest challenge that I see in terms from IT, and it goes back to like the whole shift to IT as a business, is you know, I can make a very good argument to our executive group. I can give them presentations on big data and analytics, and they love it. But when it comes to the application of that, you know, within the different business units, within and across the organization, that's where we see a problem with, you know, the introduction of these kind of displacement technologies and information, is that it, you know, sometimes there's just not the level of traction that you think would take place. And the risk, of course, in terms of reputation, is that you end up with you know, an investment that has failed, that had all the potential, but traction wasn't there, and then they look at IT and say, what happened? And it's like, well, you know, you guys didn't integrate it very well. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I feel your pain because I see this, I see it every day. You know, IT, so you know, an executive will go out and watch the US Open, and there'll be 10 big data ads from a vendor who I won't mention, you know, that they'll watch, and it sounds wonderful, and it sounds so easy, and it's going to do all sorts of things, and that's an asset that I have to get into. And then the executive comes in on Monday morning and says to his or her CIO, you need to buy that big data stuff, you know, and we need to do that now. And then to your point, it goes and traverses down into the lines of business, and many lines of business aren't ready for it, or they're not ready to take advantage of that speed and what you can do with it. And that's part of the reason why we don't advocate trying to do these massive, hey, rip it all out, replace it, but instead find some very acute examples where there is a need. You know, there's a need to extend an existing enterprise data warehouse, or there's a need to take your semi-structured data and start doing some things with it. And then you just show what we call a time to terabyte, or a quick win, where a line of business says, that is perfect, that's what I want to do, and then it starts spreading out more. But it is really important to align that partnership between IT and the line of business. And the other thing about big data is this is an area that is not easily going to go up into the public cloud, right? These are assets that IT owns, this information. There are not big enough networks to send it out of the enterprise, nor do people want to from a security standpoint. So to be successful, it is up to IT, right? And it is all about the information. But so much of, I think, what people struggle with today is that mindset and getting lines of business that can understand, well, okay, I'll get all this data in, I'll load it faster, we'll get rid of all your batch windows, but are you ready to change your own processes to make this successful as well? And I think we, HP, especially on our enterprise services side, we spend a lot of time with companies on that very aspect of it. It's complicated. Other questions? Yeah.
Follow up comment. You said you don't see this going in the cloud, but if I recall correctly, Meg said she sees the marriage of big data and the cloud to be something that probably is more in the future. When I look at our own environment, it's a challenge because big data, if you look at the appliance, in a DR scenario, we can't afford a second copy.
Right.
If you look at the backup, archiving requirements, it's huge and it puts a strain on the existing infrastructure. So I understand the security implications, but it does seem like a logical thing to move to the cloud because then you would have that economy of scale.
Yeah, so we see, on the cloud side, the public cloud is where I think it's going to be a lot more challenging. Our approach with Helion is very much a hybrid approach. So I think from a private cloud standpoint, if you look at what we're doing with OpenStack and Helion, there's a massive opportunity for big data there. Because part of what you need is the ability to quickly spin up these environments where people can take advantage of the data. So I see private cloud as being critically important to big data. I think over time, there will be plays that you can do on the public cloud. Where we see the hybrid nature actually occurring right now is we'll have a customer that has everything on-prem. And for whatever reason, they might want to just quickly spin up a sub-data mart out of the core platform. Maybe they've got 100 servers running their core platform. They just want to spin up something with like 3 nodes and get it up and running, do some analysis, and then maybe shut it down. The public cloud, from an elasticity standpoint, is very good for that. But I think if you look at the largest implementations of information, we barely see any of that out on the public cloud. We see some very small ones. It might change over time, but I think that hybrid nature is going to be critically important for that. So private cloud, I think, is very appropriate for big data. I think cloud and big data from private cloud and big data go hand in hand.
So, in your experience, do you normally see customers coming and having discussions with you after they've tried to use more traditional SQL relational databases where it's failed, or is it usually when they've said, I already know that wouldn't work and have just never tried in the first place? I guess, where do customers first come to you in your experience? Because obviously some people here are using it.
Yep.
Most are not, but I'm probably starting to think, well, how would I even start to think that this is appropriate?
Yeah, I think, people come in for different reasons. They come in and talk to us for different reasons. I think we have a segment of customers that are running a traditional enterprise data warehouse and they're not hitting their SLAs. And some of those customers turn traditional environments into whiskey bars. And some of those customers keep the traditional environment but say, well, if I could offload a piece of that and speed up that piece, then everything will work much better. And I'd say that's probably the most common scenario that we have. They already have a SQL solution, but it's either too expensive or it's not meeting the performance SLAs. We also have a fair number of greenfield opportunities that they might start with things like Hadoop, distributed file systems, and then they go and try to do the analysis, the interactive analysis, the operational reporting, and they realize that it was just never designed for that. And so they come in as a greenfield and they say, yep, there's this new thing we want to do. We can even run Vertica on Hadoop against the data. So we get a fair amount of that as well. But part of the challenge of having an analytic platform that is a database is you can do a lot of different things with it. And it's why we work with partners. It's why we have ISVs that build on top specific solutions and apps, in our own services organization to solve a customer problem. I'll give you an example. A lot of our telco customers with Haven, what they're doing now is they're taking the call detail record data. When you pick up a call on a 4G network in this country, it collects about 3,000 fields of information about the call. And to your point, they actually have to retain that for 7 years. So massive amount of that data. The innovative telcos are saying, well, what if we could take that information and create new business models? So we have one telco that's actually selling that data. They anonymize it, but they sell it to companies that want to know exactly how many fathers between 30 and 50 years old drove by this physical billboard at this point in time. Right? And so one particular telco has a massive business based on that. It wasn't a traditional SQL solution, but they've been able to take that network data and build a SQL solution. Same telco actually is saying, it would be great to build a model, a churn model, for which customers I'm going to lose by taking unstructured help desk data. My customer calls in, they're unhappy. They actually do natural language processing as well against some of the audio recordings, and then correlate that with dropped calls on the network performance, all those other things. And so now you're taking this unstructured kind of human information, you're taking this very detailed machine or log data, and it's a completely new solution that they're doing. And from a pricing perspective, I don't think you would do that in a traditional enterprise data warehouse because it would cost a fortune. But if we can give them something that's much more cost effective, leverages best in class, but yet still industry standard hardware, they're not going to get locked into a proprietary piece of hardware, that's a huge value proposition. And so a lot of what we're seeing of what people are doing falls into that bucket, and that really is the reason we created Haven. Any other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned not wanting Vertica to be synonymous with big data early on in your presentation.
Yeah.
And, big data is now kind of synonymous with Hadoop.
Yeah.
And people think when they hear big data, they think Hadoop and turn to Hadoop for the solution. What you've described, though, is that there's multiple pieces of the solution that need to be addressed.
Yep.
Maybe you can talk about where Vertica plays in this landscape now and where you see that landscape in 3 years and how those different pieces interact.
I can definitely talk about that. So I think I definitely agree with you. People are equating big data with Hadoop. Hadoop has become a brand that people are associating with big data. I think the part that Hadoop has addressed initially is distributed storage system, basically. And this grew up out of the web monsters, out of Yahoo and Google, where you can store a massive amount of data on x86 scale-out servers. So people are creating this big data lake, and they're filling it up. But if you talk to a lot of customers that have filled up the lake, they're not doing much with the data inside Hadoop. And part of that, I think, is Hadoop was never meant to do, it's not a database, right? There's MapReduce, there's other things that you can do, there's Hive, there's initiatives to create SQL on Hadoop, but it's still not yet a kind of transactional relational database. So I think there's some limitations there. But I'll tell you, we in the early days, Mike Stonebreaker, our technical founder, he wrote a blog sort of dissing Hadoop. And it was just, like lightning struck us from the developer community, which is the one that has embraced Hadoop the most. And the lesson for me was, well, maybe we don't agree with it. Maybe Mike Stonebreaker calls MapReduce group by. The database is doing it for a long time. But at the end of the day, it's out there, and it's real, and it's got inertia. And turns out there's a lot of information that companies are storing in it. So we shifted and said, well, we shouldn't try to fight this thing. We should try to help it and embrace it and focus on the areas that we do really well that it may not do that well. And so what Vertica does now is we can run on it. We can offer you full SQL analytic capabilities against your native Hadoop data. and to the last part of your question of where it's going, I think you're going to continue to see a convergence with a whole bunch of different workloads. And whether it's Hadoop or not, I think it gets back into the ILM discussion a little bit. People want, nirvana for most CIOs that I'm talking to is, give me a platform that I can connect almost any interface to. REST APIs, SQL, MapReduce, natural text search, a la Splunk. But give me that layer, and then help me orchestrate. Does it go on Hadoop? Does it go on Vertica? Does it go on an OLTP engine? Help me manage all that stuff. And HP has a history of doing a lot of the systems management. But that's kind of nirvana that people are looking for. So you see initiatives like Spark coming out as in-memory on Hadoop, or Yarn to do the orchestration. I think that will continue. And I think all of us as vendors, we need to make it easier for our customers to consume that stuff. We made, there was a press release last week, but HP invested $50 million in Hortonworks because of our belief in Hadoop and what's going on there. So I think it's rapidly evolving. I do think there's a lot of hype around it, but I also think there's a lot of hope around it as well. And people will continue to do some very innovative things there. Anything else? Yeah.
What is the most unique application that you've seen developed?
Without anyone killing me?
Yeah.
I think one of the most innovative applications, so there are two that are really innovative. One is after 2008, the financial crisis, a very large bank came to us and said, because of all this mortgage-backed security and because of the way we split up all the risk in this firm, this CFO did not have an accurate view of the true risk of the bank. The CFO came to us and said, I'd like to set up a database and figure out what the exact risk of the bank is. And so I thought, okay, maybe this isn't as cool as like Twitter or Facebook or some of the other customers, but this sounds pretty interesting. What they actually achieved was incredible. So at this bank, we're now the largest database in the bank. There's about 13.2 trillion rows. They took audio recordings of people calling into the bank. So if you called into the bank and said, I want to extend my payment, natural language processing occurred on Hadoop, actually, and it created a metadata of that call. So think about it as a sentiment of the call. So in that case, it was a negative sentiment that there's potential risk. Got loaded into the database, along with all the traditional, this bank had Teradata, but all that data, they kept Teradata, by the way, they didn't get rid of it. And they took a lot of other data. So as an example, if you filled up, this is going to freak people out, but if you fill up your car with gas in the morning, or in the evenings typically, and all of a sudden in the data from the credit card of this bank, it would notice that you're filling up your car during the day, it would flag that as a potential loss of job. This bank created an unbelievably, so accurate was the fabric and the profile of the household and the consumer that the regulators actually came in and said, it's okay that you have this, but you can no longer purchase this list on the same team as this. But what was so unique about it is the bank never intended to make loan decisions based on this data. In fact, they can't because of regulatory reasons. But what they were able to do is, after 2008, they were forced to keep a massive amount of contra revenue on their balance sheet. Once they figured out the true profile, this bank was able to free up literally billions of dollars to go back into the business. And the CFO told us for the first time, he actually felt like he had a great grip on what was going on. The other innovative story that I'll tell you that this always gets me in trouble with Meg, but I'm going to tell it anyway since you asked the question. First, let me say that we are politically an equal opportunity analytics provider. But during the last Obama election, they purchased our platform. And they literally ran their whole campaign on analytics. they innovated in ways that I think businesses can learn a lot from, specifically about A/B testing and modeling. And whether you agree with their politics or not, you got to give them credit on the way that they did this, because they completely mobilized around data. So I'll tell you a couple interesting things. Every email that went out from the campaign, they A/B tested to see the efficacy. And it turns out the most opened email had the subject line, "Hey," and it didn't actually come from Obama. There's a data scientist on this team that so part of what they were trying to do is find female independent voters that they could swing, because we all know it's all about that middle swing factor for the independents. They were trying to get them to swing, and prior to the election, they didn't believe in polling data because a lot of them were landlines. The only way they could tell if their strategy was working was by donations, and it was not working. This particular demographic was not donating any more money to the campaign. All of a sudden, one day, this data scientist comes in. They were pulling social media data. They were literally walking up to doors, knocking on the door saying, "We're from the Democratic National Committee." And based on the facial or what people would say to them, they would walk away and write in whether or not they were Republican, Democrat, or independent. They pulled all this stuff together, and the data scientist said, "I actually found an affinity for this demographic that I think could be very effective." And they said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "You're not going to believe this. It's George Clooney." And they said, "What?" And he said, "It's George Clooney." What they ended up doing was they had George Clooney sending emails and speaking at these dinner events, and the impact was massive. So the most opened email had a single line, subject was "Hey," and it came from George Clooney. And then they A/B tested, once you land on the donation webpage, they A/B tested every single photo image, and it turns out the highest donated page had a black and white image of the Obama family. That was the one that people donated to the most. But what's also really interesting is I caught up with Chris Wegerson, who ran that data science team, about 2 months ago in Pittsburgh, and I said, "So does Hay still cut it?" He's like, "No." In fact, he's a consultant on a lot of this stuff. He said, everybody that tries Hay now, nobody's opening anything that says Hay. So it changes a lot in the context of that. So those are probably two of the, I think, coolest use cases that I know about. But I hear about a lot, and as scary, I think, as some of these big brother-ish things are, I also see companies doing incredible work to protect all the data. They scrub all the sort of personally identifiable information. They really make sure that it doesn't get out anywhere. But that's a big piece of why we have enterprise security as well as part of this. But I think the things that companies are doing with information now are just really, really cool. So yeah, thanks. All right. Well, I think we're good. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Appreciate it.